Let me see, we have people coming in. And so it looks like we have a wonderful group here today. So I think we will get started. Welcome, I'm Marilyn Nonkin, Professor of Music at New York University Steinhardt School for Culture Education and Human Development. Since 2017, the American Musicological Society has partnered with NYU Steinhardt School, Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and Tisch School for the Arts to present an annual event of interest to our community, providing a forum to discuss timely issues. So today I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to Indigeneity in Music Composition and Research. And our wonderful provocative panelists include composer, performer, and artist Raven Chacon, recipient of the Berlin Prize, 2022 Pew Fellow in Residence and mentor to hundreds of composers by the Native American Composer Apprenticeship Project, and full biographies of everyone, of course, online. Composer, performer, and scholar Anne Leilehua Lanzilotti, is a renowned violist, scholar, and composer whose music explores radical Indigenous contemporaneity. Author and scholar Shana Redmond, whose works include Anthem, Social Movements and the Sound of Solidarity in the African Diaspora from NYU Press, 2014, and Everything Man, The Form and Function of Paul Robeson, Duke, 2020. And the artist, curator, and writer Dylan Robinson, Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Arts at Queen's University, and his Hungry Listening Resident Theory for Indigenous Sound Studies from the University of Minnesota Press, 2020, examines Indigenous and settler colonial listening practices. We have a lot to cover, but before we begin, I must thank my colleagues here at NYU who worked with me to put this wonderful panel together. I want to thank Kwame Coleman, Samantha Madison Cooper, hey Kwame, and Amy Galuzzo, and always we're grateful for the support of Siobhan Walker, our executive director of the AMS, and Katie Vandenmeer, the manager who's keeping everything in our event running flawlessly today, at least so far. Before we begin, just want to mention 2007, Audra Simpson observed that to speak of indigeneity is to speak of colonialism and anthropology, as these are the means through which Indigenous people have been known and are sometimes still known. So today, 15 years later, we might ask, what does it mean today to know Indigenous people, especially in and through music? Where does one listen for Indigenous voices today? What does it mean to feature Indigenous voices in music? So to begin to answer these questions or not, or to ask other questions, I've asked our panelists to speak to their own work and the state of their respective fields. And to spice things up, we're going to go in reverse alphabetical order, beginning with Dylan Robinson. So welcome, Dylan.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation. I just want to acknowledge briefly, well, I should say, Eswelt ilatal squich little quatsqua, jitzel ta hodin shoni kasta anishnari be holmach equala kasta ok almach tatha. So thanking the Indigenous folks whose lands I've been living on here in Kingston for the past 7 years, Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe folks, and also Indigenous folks whose lands you are all gathered on, wherever you are. But it's funny, I was just going to acknowledge something much more much smaller, you could say, that I'm in a gallery. I'm in an echoey gallery space, an empty gallery. So it feels quite interesting to be presenting from this space at this moment. I'm going to share some work today on some work I've been doing on Indigenous art in public spaces. And Indigenous sound art specifically. I know this is something that Raven, he has a few public sound artworks that are really, wonderful works. And not that I'm going to be talking about today, Raven, but I'd love to have conversation with you about that. And if anyone else has interest in this area, but I'm going to speak about this primarily because I am very much interested, confused, it's this point of questioning for me right now, the relationship between the materiality of Indigenous public artwork and the life of our lands. What is the relationship there between the materiality of these practices, whether that's a sonic materiality or physical materiality? How does that connect with how we understand our non-human relations? And I think one of the ways I've been looking at this is in the negative, to say that often this is not, the materiality of public artwork does not unfortunately connect with this life, or think about the relationship or reciprocity to our lands. Instead, what we see in a lot of cases, both public artworks by Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks, is work that tells us about the land, tells us the history of land, talks about, raises questions about climate justice and puts climate grief at the center. And all of these things can be important to do. However, if we understand the audience for such work as our non-human relations, it puts into question why we're centering these things, such as climate grief, because obviously the land doesn't need to hear about our grief. It is very aware. It feels this from a very different perspective. So I'm really trying to recenter the audience, you could say, the audience of Indigenous outdoor public artwork and sound artwork as being the land. So with that brief preface here, I'm going to read some work. And I'll share my screen first because I have a bit of a PowerPoint presentation. I know we're to keep this fairly short, to about 10 minutes. So let me do this. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to do this. All right. I'm going to jump right into it, and I'm going to get to this piece eventually. In the distance there, you can see work on top of this vista by the Anishinaabe artist Rebecca Belmore, and this work is called Wave Sound. But before that, I'll give just a brief description, a bit more context about this area I'm working in. So what I'm trying to do here is think through how public art might be a non-anthropocentric practice. That is, how does public art not center the human? How is this work for our non-human relations, or give something back to our relations in one way or another? And in doing so, I want to reimagine the orientation of public art as addressing the non-human, the land, and the life of our non-human relations, and consider the reparative relationship, the potential of a reparative relationship between public artwork and the life of the land. To do this, we would need to address the ethics of proximity and relation. So what we have normally in, when we think of the human as being addressed by a public artwork, there's some distance there. We pass by public artwork. We might feel hailed by it in one way or another, but there is the possibility for distance. Whereas with public artwork and non-human relations, there's a direct proximal relationships. The work is situated on top of, buried into, surrounding land, and that kind of distance is collapsed in the relationship between the human and the non-human here. So what kinds of relations should be affirmed through this intercorporeal touch between work and land? Such a practice would require that we move beyond the normative function of socially engaged public artwork to raise consciousness or tell site's history. To engage in consciousness raising where the subject of raised consciousness and the addressee are one and the same, and that is the land in both cases, would be essentially to retell the land about its own problems. To think seriously about the ways that public art might redefine its relationship with land and its life would require asking what our non-human relations might need. Further, we would need to ascertain just how to hear what our non-human relations might need, and also the most appropriate way to meet such needs, despite our limited human capacities for listening. Public artwork that makes the facts of settlement and colonization visually and materially present can be violent, not only in its centering of settler futurity, but in its physical form upon the body of the land. Without wanting to analogize this in ways that center the human, that recenter the human, we might consider ways what it might mean to place a representation of history, colonial domination, without consent upon the land that has experienced such violence. I ask for this moment of imagining through analogy in order to make more real such an experience, and in hopes that it might prompt a different sense of the stakes and urgency that might propel us toward public art practices that have a reparative function. In aid of moving closer to this possibility, I want to turn briefly to an example of such work, and this is the work that I've pointed to here in the distance, and this is Rebecca Belmore's Wave Sound. Here's a closer image of the work. The work is situated on top of a cliff in Mi'kmaq lands now called Gros Morne National Park in Newfoundland on the east coast of Canada. The piece directs a large conical listening apparatus toward the water. The work's request is that visitors might listen, as Belmore's title suggests, to the wave's sound. The form calls us to listen. Visually, it promises us a tool, an enormous earpiece, by which to hear an oral equivalent of the visual sublime. The lookout, the vistas and fjords and cliffsides that punctuate this coastline. Belmore's earpiece also exists in relationship with another form encountered on many scenic drives. This is the tower viewer. These binoculars, permanently mounted on a metal stock, have as their primary purpose and pleasure to extend the capacity to visually survey the land. While the lookout provides the opportunity for a panopticon scan and capture, sometimes through photography, of the vista, the tower viewer extends visual acuity and collapses distance. Both the visual technologies of the lookout and the tower viewer bring us closer to the possession of place through the feeling of surveillance and surveillance. I contextualize Belmore's wave sound in relation to these familiar visual technologies, not just because they're located in close proximity to Belmore's work, but because they have a relationship to the promise of vista tourism, of increased access. The promise of visual access circulates around and alongside wave sound, yet is also frustrated by it. Unlike the tower viewer, always situated at perfect eye level, to use Belmore's piece, visitors must awkwardly position their ear beside an opening that is itself shaped like an ear, roughly 1.5 feet above the ground. The work thus requires listeners to negotiate how they will place their body alongside the land. Despite the listener's height, this almost always involves variations in crouching, sitting, resting, and kneeling. Perhaps it also requires leaning in and contorting one's body. Whatever bodily improvisation listeners engage in, wave sound emphasizes that the body must have some other connection to land. In doing so, what wave sound demands of us is that the listener consider bodily contact and connection with the land as itself a form of listening. Crouching down upon the ground, I placed my head up against the cold metal, matching my ear against the metal ear of the sculpture. When I did so, what I heard was surprising. I heard almost nothing. I could barely hear the wind. I could not hear the waves despite being able to see them. I was unable to hear any other non-human relation, for example, the gulls that were flying nearby. I did not even hear the human sounds of 2 women who were also hiking up the hill, approaching me to see why I had placed my body in this position against this strange object. They asked me what I heard, and instead of answering them, I gave them my place for them to listen as well. I then asked them, "What did you hear?" And they said, similarly, they didn't hear anything, maybe a little bit of wind. I'm inclined to say that Belmore's work is not intended to function as an oral equivalent to the spyglass and view of the cliffside vista. It's not designed to bring the sounds of non-human relations closer to us, the oral equivalent to the tower viewer. In navigating the frustrated promise of hearing literal wave sounds by this earpiece made from the land directed toward the waters, I feel most keenly my body as I find a posture and position to place and rest my body alongside the land. In this orientation, an orientation of feeling through the body as listening, I listen as an international relation with a non-human. And here I'm drawing on some of the Anishinaabe author Leanne Simpson's work. I'll read this very, very briefly, her understanding of internationalism. And I'll just wrap this up here in a second because I think I'm a little over time. Leanne Simpson basically says that one doesn't need to physically travel to be engaged in internationalism. We have many relations that are coexisting in a given landmass already, whether those nations are made up of relationships of human or non-human beings. My nation is just composed of Nishnabeg. It is a series of radiating relationships with plant nations, animal nations, insects, etc., etc. So really here, just to summarize, what I'm noting is this other relationship that we might think of through internationalism. Internationalism as a relationship to differing nations or differing communities of non-human others. And when we think of this, we might actually, strangely even, apply some of the fundamental principles of internationalism, be that through an indigenous form of relationship building or a Western internationalism. For example, introduction. What does it mean for us to introduce ourselves to place and to be in that sort of very basic relationship of saying, this is who I am and this is why I'm here. So with that said, I will pass it on to the next presenter, and thank you again for listening to this presentation.
Great, thank you, Dylan. We'll move on to Shana. And of course, I love that we end with a question and not an answer. So we pass this along at the end. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for questions to be put into the chat as well. So Shana Redmond.
Thank you. Thank you to the organizers of and workers for this event. The invitation from Kwame and Marilyn was very, very lovely. Thank you for that. And offer my imperfect but profound gratitude to the First Peoples, caretakers, and dreamers on the land on which I live and think, those sovereign and unfree, then and now. So I'm really pleased to be on this panel of thinkers and artists and creators. Dylan, who I've seen already once in the last week, so it's good to see you and hear from you again. I am not a scholar of Indigenous or Native studies, even as my work in South Africa in particular has and continues to grapple with the very present ravages of settler colonialism through attention to First Peoples' lives and creations. What my work has and continues to do is to revive and revisit questions that I understand as deeply connected to, if not inspired by, decolonial and global majority ways of knowing. These questions are far from singularly scholarly in merit, for they represent and catalog the ways in which dispossessed peoples, the ways in which I survive and build, even if under grave precarity. How do we engage with and live through the world and all of its frightening, devastating manifestations without losing our ties and commitments, without sacrificing pieces of ourselves and each other, without compromising others in service of a fictive ideal that has been sold to us without our consent and which carries with it only debt? In focusing my scholarship on global methods of relation and communal ways of knowing, other effects and consequences have been revealed. One of which I'm quite proud is exposure of the failures of the state to contain or destroy Black and other dispossessed communities. We are still here, and we know this assuredly through the music. The anthems that traveled over and across nations in order to hold together citizens of no single nation. The vocal travels of a domestically detained Paul Robeson as he literally sung over fictions of the border and under newly cabled oceans. And my recent scholarly intrigue with the infrapolitics of Black listening before fatal traffic stops and execution of no-knock warrants could easily be overshadowed by the death-making apparatus that makes all of these people, that makes me radically vulnerable. And while some days I stay there in the pain and desolation, on many others, the music pulls me from my knees and confirms that we are not only surviving, but elevating all forms of musicking, of knowledge, of being. We take words and sounds and push them to their greatest, most impossible extension, living life where we're told there is none and finding love in loss. I'm called to consider the music of soul eclectic musician Leon Bridges, for example. Sweet is not a word that most would use to describe our contemporary moment, marked simultaneously by disproportionate vulnerabilities to infection and violence. This time, this day in the Black US is overwrought by danger, but not without the possibility of its opposite. not the safety that we're told to believe in, but the care of which Bridges sings. Opening with a visual of the Tupac-inspired rose growing from concrete, the live recorded performance of his song Sweeter, featuring producer saxophonist Terrace Martin, extends the original song by more than 2 minutes and invites jazz titan Robert Glasper to play keyboards where listeners of the single would otherwise hear a guitar. And I'll put the link for this performance in the chat. Responsibly distant from one another, the musicians model the multiple scales of our current strategy, from the sounds of the music to their formation on the street. This song, which speaks clearly to the terrors and rituals of the present, was written in 2019. But as you can see, Bridges said to James Corden a year later, it's a perpetual narrative. This changing same, as Amiri Baraka called it, in which we face vulnerability repeatedly, may seem to some a too long memory, but it's the knowledge of prior siege that calls this latest iteration into focus and allows Bridges to ad-lib at the end of his performance, "I'm hoping for a life for my brothers and my sisters." Hope and life are tightly held in this moment when both are under threat. The live performance of this song by Bridges offers a special assurance that we will not only acknowledge Black life, but it's living too. That we will persevere, surviving long enough to not only fight, but to sing another day. That Black people in this country and around the world will again know sweetness, for this too is freedom. We must hold in tension being hunted and creating the world anew, for some of us, is now a muscle memory, though it is not to say that the muscle is not fatigued, exhausted, and in need of repair. What gets us up in the morning, the sun, our loves, the land, the songs, is as important, perhaps even more so, than that which we struggle against. Pursuing those mundane, exquisite things is what I am tuned to now, in recognition of the fact that without them, we are not us, and being us is everything urgent. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Again, if everyone lets these ideas foment, and then when we complete it, we'll have more of a discussion. Let's turn this over to Leilehua Lanzilotti. Thank you for being here.
Mai ka ko o Leilehua ko uinoa, no ka ua vaahila o manoa mai au, o vaahila ko o mauna, o waihiki ku ahu pua'a, o kona ku umoku, o oahu ku umoku puni, he haku mele au. Noho au ma Molokai, aloha e na au makua o keia aina mai ka pi'ina ka velona kala e ma lama aina. Good afternoon, I'm Dr. Ann Leilehua Lanzilotti, and I am a composer, performer, and scholar. I just introduced myself in Hawaiian, or Olelo Hawaii, which also meant introducing myself in an Indigenous way, describing not only the island I'm from, but the mountain range and the rain. I also gave a living land acknowledgement in Olelo Hawaii as a way of decolonizing the space, recentering Indigenous ways of knowing not only the specific language itself, but the way the language lends itself to acknowledging and honoring land. And I say living land acknowledgement because I've had really beautiful conversations with other Indigenous leaders about the idea of a living land acknowledgement that means something about action. So not just kind of lip service to this is where we are, but what is a part of what you're actively doing. And for me, that is about having moved back to Hawaii in the last year, being a part of the Indigenous language revitalization movement here in Hawaii. And that can mean a lot of different things. For those of you listening, if you don't know the native peoples or the first peoples of the place that you're on, there are many resources for you to look at that. Sometimes it's kind of complicated, but there's a great app, nativeland.ca, that you can check out. and other great resources. And I encourage you to think about this concept of living land acknowledgement. That's something that's been really present for me this last 2 weeks as I've been on Molokai, which is one of the less populated islands in Hawaii for an artist residency and has one of the largest heiau or temples in Hawaii. It's been very, very different and really incredible being here, and made me think, gave me the time to think a lot about a different sense of space and a different time, and a different way of looking at things that's inherent to Kanaka Maoli or Hawaiian composition traditionally. If you look at the idea of traditional Hawaiian mele or the idea of Kanaka cartography, a lot of the hula and mele or song or poetry was different ways of encoding material because it was only a spoken language traditionally. And so we have these incredible stories about Pele and Hi'iaka or other, we have this word mo'olelo that both means story and history. It's kind of that these things are connected to real people and real things that happened. And so they're not just stories, they're not just compositions, but they're also embedding things like scientific fact. Pele and her sisters are all, in fact, different manifestations of lava and their different states. And so thinking of them as sisters is actually this way of explaining this scientific phenomenon that's happening, and giving voice to that and giving name to that and connection. This happens in a lot of different Indigenous languages, and is something that's a wonderful way to explore the way of looking at the world. Focusing for this panel on the idea of composition, I wanted to speak a little bit about the concept of the word for composing in Hawaiian, which is haku. So I said, he haku meleao. Haku is also the word that we use for making lei. So haku lei is to make a lei. And thinking about that again in this idea of lei making and composing or storytelling and embedding histories is a different way of thinking about composition and how these acts are related to physicality and embed stories and help stories to live on. This is something that our last queen, Leilehua Lanzilotti, knew very well. She was a composer, and not only a composer, but she also was the organist for Kawaiahao Church, which was this really important, it still exists today and does services in Hawaiian. And she was also the choir master. She wrote about 150 songs in her lifetime, including 7 during the almost year that she was imprisoned in Iolani Palace after the overthrow, for supposedly knowing about trying to take back the kingdom. And a part of her legacy was this idea of uplifting stories and embedding Hawaiian stories into song, because shortly after that, in 1896, there was a law that then banned any kind of teaching in Hawaiian language that wasn't repealed until 1986, during my lifetime. In fact, the year I was born in 1983, there were fewer than 50 speakers of native speakers of Hawaiian under the age of 18. So this is a really dramatic thing that we've been thinking about here in Hawaii, and I wanted to just briefly talk, language helps us to understand things. And we take a lot also from the African scholar, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, from his book, Decolonizing the Mind. And he says, thus, the second aspect of language as culture is an image-forming agent in the mind of a child. Our capacity to confront the world creatively is dependent on how these images correspond or not to that reality, how they distort or clarify the reality of our struggles. And so growing up in a culture that had so much language loss and culture loss, that's reclaiming that through the legacy of people like Leilehua Lanzilotti, who was a composer who embedded that language and those stories and those ideas through composition, is a really strong part of our history. And so while I talk about being a contemporary Hawaiian composer, this is not something new. I feel very strongly that this is something that Leilehua Lanzilotti was doing in her songs, holding up Hawaiian language and chant equally to the Western forms of song that she was writing in. Instead of thinking the way those songs are usually thought about as that she was able to modernize by being Western, I like to think about it instead as that she was holding up those different forms of composition as equal, and that that's a different way of looking at that. So kind of finishing up, so I can pass it on to Raven, I just wanted to read one last quote from Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty, which is an incredible, incredible resource. From the first chapter, Contested Indigeneity, in which Kahanui writes, in the US context, they argue, one of the defining elements of American colonial rule is the fastening of Indigenous peoples to the concept of colonial time by locating them out of time where they are not allowed modernity. This shackling Indigenous identity to archaic form upholds the concept of authentic Indigenous peoples always being already primitive or static, positioned to continuously struggle for recognition of their humanity, while the colonizer is always characterized as civilized or advanced, thereby rationalizing domination of Indigenous peoples as a form of progress. It is this enduring notion of the savage that continues to be used by states in their attempt to justify political subordination, such as the domestic dependent nation status subject to US plenary power in the case of federally recognized tribal nations. Thank you so much for letting me be a part of this panel. And I'd like to, with that, pass on to Raven Chacon.
Thank you. Yate, Raven Chacon inishe, Torochin inishle, Nakaidene Bashishchin, Chinle, Arizona, do Biel de Dasanil, de Nasha, do Red Hook, New York, de Nasha. Thank you for having me on this. You know, I've been struggling trying to explain what I do because it changes every day, I think, and my reasons for doing what I do changes every day. It's rare I get to talk to music folks, you know, it's usually the art people, so that throws a wrench in it sometimes too. But you know, I call myself, I mean, this is a rare one where I'm even speaking in Navajo, but I always call myself a composer because that's what I set out to do, was to make music. And you know, I found that there was some comfort in there, and that music didn't have to be about anything. You know, it's actually kind of quite bad at telling stories. And I mean, you could put a title on it or something, and you can go between major and minor chords and maybe tell a story there. But yeah, it wasn't enough for me sometimes. So I found myself doing other things. I found myself making field recordings, building instruments, working a lot with noise, making recordings, doing things on the stage, doing things off the stage. And sometimes things wouldn't fit on the recording or on a score or on the stage. And so those things became, you know, installations, sound installations or videos, or even other kinds of works with no form at all. And so I'm still trying to think of what it is I do and how I present some of this, and thinking about the questions posed of Indigenous voices in these places, trying to think if we are already positioned into a place where we have to be the historian, and not having a freedom to speculate about any other topic in the world other than our own lands and our own histories. And even if we do, then it gets kind of framed as futurism or something, indigenous futurism. You hear that fad a lot right now. And but what does that mean? You know, are we really talking about time when we're talking about the future? And is this future supposed to just be optimistic? You know, why can't I talk about that we're all doomed? We lost, we screwed it up. I don't have the answer there. I'm just saying, what if I wanted to say that, you know, not to bring anybody down this afternoon, but these could all be topics for work that I'm interested in. And today I might say that it could be an opportunity to talk about all the anonymous works I've done, because I had to escape this, finding myself as my own character inside of this work. Every time I get invited to do a talk or an interview or something, it's already going to be skewed towards me having some kind of position. And so those are the things I'm working with, you know. I think about noise, why I make noise. I'd like to think it's some cathartic scream at the white man, but no, I just like the sound of it, you know. That's really the reason. And why do I make chamber music? It's not to put indigenous voices into the classical genre at all. I just have huge respect for those instruments and want to learn more about them. And every piece I make is more research into that. It's actually maybe even selfish. I just want to know about, you know, how the clarinet works. And so in thinking of all of this, I think that there's something that I'm trying to work on that is counterpoint. This code switching between contrary and parallel motion, finding my own position as it relates to other musicians, audiences, funders, my own community, and navigating all of that in between. And I think that's all I have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Raven. Thank you, all of you, because your ideas and perspectives present, I think, this sort of fascinating counterpoint, as Raven said, about finding our positions, or which way, how we are oriented towards the world, and what's the world we choose for our artistic research. I'd like to, before asking for broader for comments or questions from our audience, if our panelists have any responses or comments which resonated with them from their colleagues here. Is there anything you'd like to respond to before we open things up? Yes, Dylan.
Thank you, everyone, for your presentations and talking about your work. I have a lot of questions, actually, but I just in this moment, I want to pick up on something you just mentioned, Raven, and that is always, you know, having the option to do a range of different things. And I think, you know, a lot of what I hear and a lot of what I know about your practice, it really takes up these questions of formalism and aesthetics, right? Why we do these things, so that all artists, you know, presumably do, but Indigenous artists quite often do get slotted into at least the expectation of needing to provide the history or the culture, or, and I think there's nothing wrong with you know, it's beautiful, you know, to talk about our histories and our culture, but I think the orientation is always so that it fills up those who do not know, right? And so that, again, is the sort of directionality of this. It's the presumption that we are here to inform those who are uninformed, rather than to, you know, give back to our people or our communities or other Indigenous artists, you know, who we are, right? And share those histories back with us. And so I'm wondering, yeah, and I think this is a question for everyone, or a thought, maybe, if anyone else is interested to take up, like what we do when we reorient who our audiences are. Or not, we don't have to discuss that.
Great. Do we have open this up then. Obviously, it's been really very provocative. And I think the whole idea, of course, again, of whether you talk about being a scholar when we're designing this panel, talking about the idea of what is musical research, right? Not just a scholarship or performance incorporating this kind of knowledge-seeking endeavor, or what are we trying to achieve with the projects that we pursue? Of course, again, yeah, what is that? What is the end goal, and how does that relate to the different aesthetics and perspectives that we adopt?
Yeah, I think I have something to say on that. Yeah, thank you, Dylan, for going deeper and explaining, I think, what I was trying to say in there too. And I think, you know, we do have an obligation to tell history as it hasn't been told before, or as it has been erased. Absolutely. And the fear is somebody else does that who doesn't know anything about it. You know, they learned it from a book or a mini series or something. And but how has that progressed? You know, I think I always think back on Lewis Ballard, you know, the great, you know, considered the grandfather of American Indian composers, and how he had to navigate, you know, what he was doing at that time to do his work, to be acknowledged, and him being this kind of sole figure who had to represent a lot of tribes, did so in his music. I mean, one critique could be that his music was very pan-Indian. You know, he had a piece about Hopi culture. He had a piece about, you know, Apaches. He had all these different, you know, things, having to cover, you know, basically all of North America in his work. And it's beautiful that we, I think, have evolved from that, or learned from that, or we are comfortable enough to speak about our own histories, our own people more specifically. And I think the navigation is and the thing we're always trying to fight against is that then we become this textbook, we become this representative of our people, and that's a whole lot of different other work that's complicated and scary. You know, I don't want to be in that position all the time, to be that face.
Well, there's danger in fixity in that, right? That you end up being mired in a kind of narrative that you did not create, but that you have been now swept up in it for the sole purpose of telling a very kind of singular, narrow kind of story, right? And so I think the question, Dylan, that you posed around our audience is very much related to Marilyn's question about why do we do as we do? Because I think for many of us, who we do it for is at the very center of the question of why we do as we do. But it's not always articulated as such, right? It's not always possible, or certainly not always invited, for us to be able to say, well, I wrote this way because you Academy, or you Arts Funder, or you whomever were not my audience, right? That we have different kinds of responsibilities and ways of committing to the peoples and other, you know, biospheres around us in ways that are not always going to be legible. And I think the question of legibility that Raven was getting to, but also that Leilehua was speaking to, even in our efforts towards translation, right? Those of you who are speaking in your Indigenous languages and then making the effort towards translation for audiences who are not knowledgeable of those forms, that's a lot of work, right? But it's also a certain amount of care in thinking about to whom we speak and under what circumstances. And I think all of those questions are really central to thinking about power and our relationship to it.
And thank you, Shana. That's really a wonderful way to put that. Raven, to talk to another point you made about futurism, I was just thinking, you know, I do think it really is important to talk about those other kinds of futures of where we are now. And it made me think, you know, when I was growing up, I was already in that bleak futurism of language, where I really believe that people did not speak Hawaiian anymore. So much so that I, you know, when it was available for me to take a language in school, the only language available that I was part of was Chinese. So I'm fluent in Chinese because I took that in school instead, because that was what was available for me to take. That was a part of my heritage, instead of Hawaiian, where I was living. And I really believed that it was a dead language. And I think coming back after more than 20 years away and seeing all the incredible effort of the people that have been on the ground doing it and saying, no, we still exist, taking that from the Maori pods and how they did that and seeing that happen, I see that idea of Polynesian futurism or Indigenous futurism, which of course is taken from, the idea of the phrase Black quantum futurism, meaning what if Indigenous people actually do exist in the future? And I am excited about that because I remember a time as a little kid where I thought we don't exist, our language doesn't exist. And all of the policies in Hawaii, which I don't know as much about the continent, but is similar, is this idea of blood quantum that's basically erasing us. Like if you're not, there's this whole idea of you not being Hawaiian enough, that then you're erased, which is used in a different extractive way in the African American community, the African heritage on the US, and blood quantum is this whole other complicated thing that was again used extractively to keep people in servitude and to be extractive in that way. But in Indigenous cultures, it was used in this other ways to say, well, if we can marry you off or rape you or do something to lessen the blood quantum, then it means that you don't exist. And then you fit into this other category. And so I see the idea that futurism being like, no, we do exist. The culture still exists. And it's exciting to me to think about now, Raven, like, my cousin and I really, really disagree on the issue of Mauna Kea right now. And that's great that he wants to be seen as Hawaiian and I want to be seen as Hawaiian, and we disagree because there's enough of us now that we can disagree. I would love if, there can be disagreements in Hawaiian about these different issues and these different new works, because it means our language is alive and we can disagree about it. And so that's what I find exciting about that concept. But I forgive me if I'm not articulating myself well. The idea of blood quantum is so complicated and affects different communities in very, very different ways. So I hope that's clear, expressing that about how it works a little bit in Hawaii.
Yeah, thank you, Leilehua. In a way, a theme that comes out when Shana was talking about not just Black lives, but Black life, the idea of life and whatever. I'm obsessed with this idea of what is music research, but in a sense, it is about a living tradition and something which is surviving through a practice, right, a living praxis, not something which is tied to a prehistory, but something which continues to evolve and which gives this practice of ours a kind of meaning. We have a little bit of time left. If anyone has some questions or further comments on some of the themes that have come. Speaking of,
sorry. I just want to respond too about this still on this futurism thing is my problem is the positioning into this perpetual deferment, as if we can't imagine just today, what's going on, and then the aesthetics that are around that, I think too, as far as artists are concerned and artworks and even sonorities, somebody who works with electronics automatically, they're Afrofuturist or Indigenous futurist. These instruments might be from the 80s already, they're already 30 years old. So there's a positioning there that I'm skeptical of. It's the same kind of positioning that if you're doing anything political, then you're an activist artist or something like that, And those are the things I'm trying to at least just question when they come up, and not necessarily jump onto. but definitely the optimism of imagining yourself forever and all of the spectrum of possibilities that can be around that, you know, the new mixtures. I think all of that, I think, is exciting for sure. But I fear that we're jumping over something that's really important right now by talking about next year.
I was going to add, I was wondering if the activism word was going to come up, and how maybe for Dylan and Shana to respond to how you may see your work in relation to activism, if you see that as a positive or negative, or any conflict.
Shana, do you want to go ahead?
I'll just say very briefly that I always write to be a service, right? So any insights, any potential suggestion towards strategy, any of those things that can be pulled from my work in service of people's movements, I feel as though I've done my work. That is where I hope to be beneficial, or to be used. I do think that the ways in which activism has been commodified is deeply, deeply problematic. I try not to use the word activist, certainly in relationship to my own practice, but is one that I'm reticent to use even in description of others unless they use that word themselves, because of the ways in which I think it's been pulled in so many different kinds of directions that there's no center of gravity anymore. And I think we need new languages for thinking about how we relate to one another and to the rest of the world, and activists may not be it.
Oh, I think you're muted, Dylan.
Sorry, I had it on. I guess I had it on unmuted before, but I feel very similar to Shana as well. I don't use the word in relation to the work that I do, but I do try and think about the ways that my work might contribute in some small way, even to language learning. You know, the presence of our language in print and in public spaces. How does that work that I do in those areas lessen shame, which still exists around language learning? How does that work contribute in some way to the work that different kinds of work that needs to happen? But I think activism is something that is not something I feel comfortable with, at least in my own work. But to activate, you know, I'm centrally concerned with activating writing in one way or another, so that the act of reading becomes something that propels us into different kinds of doing, you know, whether that be language writing or addressing specific audiences or using different forms or poetics. You know, there are a lot of different strategies and choices there, and also providing choices. I think, you know, I don't feel uncomfortable at all when I say that my work is to open up spaces for younger Indigenous artists, people, you know, like my cousin who always felt that education was against him, you know, to do something more, to feel welcomed, and that there is possibility within not just the kind of education, the university, but various kinds of education, language learning, community-based learning. There's still a lot of work that we need to do there. I believe, you know, as Indigenous folks, to support younger generations, and I see my work contributing in a small way to that as well.
Absolutely, Dylan. And I was going to just say, with connecting that back to what Raven was saying about the ability to just exist in the present. I think a part of all of our kind of hesitation around using the word activism is, you know, for us to just exist is radical in some ways, but also, why does it have to be activism for me to use my name? Or why does it have to be activism for us to just speak in our language? That's one of the 2 official languages in the state. Why does it have to be activism to do these things that for other groups of people is just existing? And so I think that, I hear that as a really deep part of what Raven is saying, that I want to honor, that, for us to just exist in the present is really important, to have that space to be multiplicitous and to be able to have space to dream in different ways in the present, so that we can make the space, as you were saying, Dylan, for other people to be also feeling like they can just exist.
Great, thank you. I see our clock is ticking. If I would like to open it one final time, if anyone has any additional questions. I think it's been a fascinating discussion. I wanted to thank our panelists for your thoughtfulness, your generosity of time. It's been fascinating to hear you speak, and I think there is so much food for thought here. This is absolutely a topic that deserves a great deal of attention. I just want to thank you for being here, and thank everyone for listening. So everyone, be well, and let's all stay in touch. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.